No, I just want to make sure we don't come up missing this requires CNS.
Did you did you fetch it just recently? Just now.
Yeah. When it comes, mostly I'm much more interested in CFRG.
This is James. This goes first.
And then David said
This goes first.
Yeah.
Day-to-day stuff.
And then
No.
It's crypto issues.
This is first.
And the report some of these. But yeah.
This is second. So this is first. And this is the yeah.
That's it.
Right. Yes. And the first one is actually two.
Clients some issues either addressed or might be issued. Google review reports.
He's here.
But from my boring, so fixing boring review reports response. Often in the crypto algorithms, the foundations, if there are any of those, like
Let me try.
We still found an X509
in which version?
maybe 3 months ago, maybe perhaps.
Hey, good morning. So it works.
So I'm not.
So one thing I'm finding I'm listening on VDECO also, maybe figure out how to turn that off.
There are a lot of
Maybe the echo's going to be
Well, when you talk to us, you absolutely need to close the data line.
Okay, so I think
Let me figure out how to.
I'm working on one.
Just disconnect it. Yeah.
oh,
And many issues.
Now the question is, where is the mic? Not the mic. Where is the output of the audio here on my computer?
So first rewrite the pattern.
sometimes it's better to kill things with fire.
And this is how the ground immediately was fixing this. If you saw the pile of crap in this cell, so this code is too hard.
I mean, I can put on.
Production has two problems. One, and then later, as part of the drama, people reported, gee, we don't listen to
Do you have the VDA to display for your
it's a real issue.
Okay, I think I found
We're doing impromptu remote. Oh, hi, Jim.
Did you want to talk to Alexa? Devastating attack tonight.
I talked earlier this morning.
Yeah. So we were thinking of swapping AD because it's more male and it makes more sense for things.
Yeah, I heard some rumors about it.
Just
Yeah, so are you
kind of makes sense, I think.
Yeah, so are you going to to say that this was thing or whatever?
So I can keep telling Alexi just say when you want to take it over and press the button.
Where do I know your name from?
Oh, I keep telling you we can do it today. I think it makes it makes no difference. So
Yes.
see here? No, you can't see.
Right. So you heard what I was telling David, right? And I think you'll agree wholeheartedly, right? It wasn't.
Okay, yeah.
Right. And to the extent that Google is investing in non-proprietary, reasonably portable foundational stuff that Upsell could benefit from.
Yeah, I would do that with them. More quiet.
Right, no, but if they write a library
But
that provides some basic functionality that we can import, maybe be able to directly import the code that they have using that library. So we can still take the library and start porting it ourselves. If they have a good buffer library, we should freaking use it. And then later, it'll be easier to someday maybe share more code if big solutions are more common.
When you get towards like that, it's always fine. It doesn't have to be fixed enough.
I've noticed all this fuss about the release. I have no comment at all. But yeah, sure, we should have one soon. But yeah, yes. So, and so if Alexi turns up, we can say that he's or something.
To you, I
Yeah, right. Oh,
thought it up to you guys. Excellent. Okay, Jim, how are you?
we're working on the right stuff. CS 1.3.
Okay. So I hope that you will, that they will hear you, basically.
My complaint, as you
So,
also heard me talking today, is that I think
Mito-
that
Mito
the
might
work
be
on the
easier.
Intel i6
Does it work? Do we have it?
You've seen me writing.
Oh, okay. Now we say maybe.
For Intel.
Yeah, I think we might use Meet Echo then, Jim. Well, let's try it with Meet Echo and use this as fallback if it doesn't work.
You know, being
All right, we should start the meeting now, so if mute.
Yeah, so bye.
We've lost the year
For now.
All right, folks.
which is
We were about to start. We were supposed to start 5 minutes ago. So everybody sit down and figure out if you're the right person to take notes or channel jabber. Man, excellent. Thank you, Rich, for channeling jabber. Anybody willing to take notes? We ain't going anywhere without it. Come on, wake up. All right. While you think about that, note the note well. Still, we need a note taker. Thank you very much. All right, we're not gonna. We promise not to make any sort of decisions before you've had John Levine has had a chance to drink a bit of coffee and sort of get organized. Right, this is UTA. If you want it to be somewhere else, maybe it's us that's in the wrong place. Who knows?
Yeah, okay, we're trying to get back to business. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah, you got to do that.
Okay, now you can hear me. So today our agenda is again dedicated to email with TLS. And basically we have 3 presenters here. The last one is going to be remote, hopefully. And we start, and we go according to our agenda. We start with the first one. The 2 drafts are going to be presented by the same person and same deck of slides. So yeah, so Dan, please come up.
All right.
Yeah. Just...
Thank you. So I think you're good, right?
Not even going to try that. You're going to have to tell me what to flip.
I'll tell you when to flip. Yeah, it's cool. Okay, so I'm Dan Margolis. I'm talking about 2 drafts, which probably most of you have already seen, or hopefully you have already seen. One is reporting of TLS delivery failures for SMTP, and the other is SMTP strict transport security. And I'm just going to sort of mash them together. So there's one slide deck, and I kind of cover them in one piece. Mostly these are sort of small updates since the last update we gave at IETF 95. I think no big changes that will surprise people, and we'll sort of talk about where we plan to go, where our deployment efforts are, and sort of hopefully get some useful feedback from you guys. So next slide, please. So sort of really short 60-second overview of SMTP STS for people who aren't familiar with it. We have a text record on the mail delivery domain, which says I support STS. We have a HTTPS endpoint with the policy describing when you expect TLS connections to this domain and what senders should sort of look for in the MX and this kind of thing. And essentially this looks like HSTS. So we use web PKI validation, so cert validation based on a trusted certificate authority. We enforce this by sort of caching the policy for a long time, and every time we talk to this domain from here on, we sort of expect the policy to match until it expires or is updated. And finally, we have this report or enforce mode, so we can sort of do soft deployments and report failures, but not actually bounce mail until we're sort of comfortable that things work. Next slide, please. So between the last draft and the current one, we made, I think, 3 significant changes. The first is that we split out reporting. We thought that that was sort of generally useful, and the people who didn't implement STS might still benefit from reporting, either because they want to know about TLS failures with Start TLS, or because they want to know about Dane failures, or just sort of a generally useful thing. That's now its own text record, which just describes where to send failures. And as shown there, it can be a mail to link, or not shown there, it can be a HTTP link instead. So you can report out of band, upload a report sort of like HPKP supports, and say essentially what MXs you talked to, what failures you saw, and sort of provide general stats there. I think that's largely uncontroversial, and I'm actually not going to spend that much more time on TLS RPT because I think it's extremely simple and sort of generally useful. Second change, we essentially simplified the text record. So the point of the text record in our first proposal was it had a copy of the proposal, but because we're not assuming DNSSEC, it's really just a copy of the policy, which serves just to indicate which version of policy you should be looking at, whether you should look at the HTTPS endpoint. And so we're using DNS as sort of a signaling layer. And so we've simplified this to make it clear that you actually can't rely on the DNS record. It's just a copy of sort of an ID that uniquely identifies the current version of the policy. You want to get the policy, you go to the HTTPS endpoint. So this was discussed also on the mailing list. I don't think it's hugely controversial. The third point is we had sort of previously had this, I think, somewhat hacked up effort to sort of coexist with DNSSEC for sort of validating the DNS records and Dane for authenticating MXs. And I think it caused a lot of problems, both in terms of extra complexity and in terms of sort of the lack of clarity on what to do if, like, the recipient domain has a Dane policy which doesn't validate, and the STS policy said rely on Dane and do report only mode. So this is sort of an odd scenario where if you look at Dane only, you would fail the message, but if you look at STS, you might be less clear. And so we basically just wholesale eliminated the DNSSEC from the proposal. I think now it's sort of more clearly an alternative, and I think they can coexist. I think there's no real downside to implementing both, but they're now separate, and I think it just makes things a lot simpler. So those are the 3 significant changes. Next slide, please. And we closed a bunch of other issues between draft 0.0 and draft 0.1, I think largely syntactic. So as we've been going along, actually implementing this on our sides, we've discovered cases where things are underspecified, or like the ABNF is incorrect, because ABNF is hard, or things like this. And we've just sort of made a bunch of, like, as you can sort of see here, and actually on the next slide as well, please, a bunch of sort of minor syntax changes, which I think don't change the semantics heavily. And so that's more or less that. We've been tracking the open issues on
There's complaints, particularly through Medico, about the.
We're not coming through on the mic.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
And also the fuzz, it's pretty out of focus.
Sorry, I didn't hear anything you said.
You heard nothing I said like the whole time.
No, you.
Oh, him. Oh, he was saying the mic wasn't working, so I was kind of.
That, and also that it's kind of out of focus, and on the other slide, it was particularly bad on the remote.
Okay. So for people on the remote, I think
The slides are available, right, online.
yeah, and the screenshots were just sort of like screenshots of the GitHub issues list, and I think people who visit this URL could sort of see the recent progress. So that's like the really, I think I spent 5 minutes, right? That's like the 5-minute summary of sort of what we did between the last update at IETF 95. I think nothing hugely surprising except for those sort of 3 fairly significant changes. We have some open questions which I think are also sort of, again, like sort of not changing the semantics dramatically, not changing the sort of deployment behavior dramatically, but maybe some sort of like stylistic questions. The first is really this discussion of like the nested subdomain versus a single subdomain for hosting the policy. We were kind of worried on the one hand about being able to use like a wildcard.example.org domain certificate to sign the policy versus like the risk of, say, DynDNS or Tumblr, people who host untrusted subdomains having a persistent denial of service by somebody hosting a policy that's not legitimate. So this was kind of one discussion we had, whether we should host the HTTPS endpoint at policy.mta.sts.example.org versus just like a one-level subdomain. I think we had some questions on the mailing list about how smart hosting should work. To me, and this is Victor's nodding. So to me, smart hosting is sort of, you just use the policy of the smart host domain, not the original destination domain. I mean, you're rewriting the domain, but this is sort of the kind of operational stuff that I think maybe doesn't require normative specifications, but is kind of a little bit unclear in the spec today. Similarly, somebody asked, should we allow HTTPS redirects on policy locations? So again, we sort of didn't specify this. I think it's quite reasonable. Obviously, you shouldn't be able to redirect from HTTPS to HTTP because that has no value, but sort of a reasonable question. And then we had sort of a question about where the .well-known policy should be and sort of how it makes deployment easier. So those are, I think, the 4 things I can think of recently, which are sort of like likely to change or sort of noticeably going to change. And then in terms of current efforts, so the Google policy is live, and we expect send time validation and logging and eventually enforcement if it works sometime this quarter. Microsoft, I think the policy is like half live or soon to be live, and they're working on send time validation. Comcast, the policy is live. The HTTPS endpoint has the wrong certificate right now, but that will be fixed very shortly. And report only mode is planned. Yahoo report only mode is planned. 1&1, I think report only mode is planned for a number of domains this summer. So we sort of know of a handful of big deployments. Most of them are people who contributed to the draft, which I think report only mode will happen in the near future for a lot of people. Enforcement will happen a little bit further off. I don't know of other deployments, but there might be some. And that's basically the status. One more slide. So TLS RPT, just to sort of cover that, because that was also supposed to be the topic here. Yeah.
I kind of think maybe we will stop here and take questions, clarifications, and hear from you. What would you like from the working group to do? And particularly if we go to the list of open questions, it's 3, yeah, back. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, this one.
Can you actually go one more forward? This is Barry Liba. Yeah, I was being silly. This is Barry Liba. I see this is, no, the next slide. Yeah, I see this as a nice list. I see there's no implementation section in the document. I suggest that you put that in so that when the document is reviewed, everyone can see the running code that's out there.
Do you mean see code on GitHub or something? Or
No. See
who's actually working on it.
Who is implementing this? There's what? Yeah, there's a document that used to be an experimental, now it's BCP, that suggests that we put implementation section, implementation considerations or implementation report or whatever it's called, and I suggest you do that.
Okay, yeah, I think it makes sense.
Hi, from Jim Fenton. What deployment is there beyond publications of records, e.g. and MTAs?
So in terms of send time validation, I mean, at Google, we anticipate we'll have send time validation working this quarter. I think a number of our other sort of co-authors and partners expect to have maybe offline report-only implementations like this summer, this quarter. I think one reasonable question would be when and whether we'll have an implementation in an open source MTA like Postfix that people can use. I would actually like to contribute open source code that does validation, but I don't know that I have the time to do that. So.
So in Postfix, probably nothing before, Victor Duchovny, in Postfix, probably nothing before the spec is finalized. And perhaps even though the outline, at a very high level, the spec is not too bad, the details need a great deal of work. So if we think that 01 is near a final draft, I think we'll see probably an 05 before it's really done. One obvious example that actually we neglected to pay attention to is that the ID field probably needs multiple values. Otherwise, you can't do rollover of IDs reliably. So we expect
this is actually the on the previous slide, question 4. So Nico's suggestion around this was actually just to move the hosting to the ID in the URI, and that way you can sort of do rollover easily. But it's a right. I think this is the same issue.
No, because if you introduce a new policy, there is not yet in DNS caches an ID that matches it. And when people retrieve the policy the IDs won't match and they'll keep retrieving the policy over and over again, but their cache will say that it's the wrong ID. Anyway, we can talk about that offline. So the ID field needs revision. The entire future section is either impractical or irrelevant, needs to be deleted, but we can again discuss that on the list. The state machine is underspecified, needs to be expanded to take into account multiple MX hosts. There's some editorial issues about just how the motivation in terms of comparisons of Dane and this, that not so much by advocating for Dane, but I think need clarification. Some of the descriptions are a little off.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would focus on
a bunch of work here.
Like the state machine and the sort of deployment issues are the ones I'd focus on, because I think those are the ones where you can really tell us, you know, as I was saying earlier, I mean, I think these are issues where you're likely to discover maybe different implementation issues than we are. Certainly, I think the normal usage of postfix looks very different than the normal deployment of an MTA at Google. And I don't necessarily have as much insight as you do into sort of the former. So, you know, I'd rather not do 4 more revisions before I get all the postfix feedback. I'd actually rather get the feedback sooner if it's possible. That doesn't mean you have to implement it and tell us what we're being stupid about, you know, now. But like, I do think the sooner that we have that working open source implementation in sort of smaller deployments, the sooner we would get that feedback and we wouldn't have to do the 4 more revisions, right?
Dan York, Internet Society. So can you just talk me through the Dane, the coexistence that you mentioned?
Right. So we don't make any real statements. I mean, I think aside from sort of a mention, as Victor was saying, that there are other systems out there, we don't really make any statements about how it should relate. The coexistence that I would imagine is, you know, on send time, you can certainly validate both. I think we had some discussion on the mailing list about, you know, potentially if you validate Dane, you don't bother as a sender to validate SDS, which I think is quite reasonable.
Sure.
I don't really think we need to make a statement, right? But it's sort of, if you're sending mail, you obviously can check one and say, okay, you know, DNSSEC checks out, it's probably good.
Right.
If
So
there's
it becomes more of a policy decision that the sending MTA makes.
Right. So I think at send time, it's a policy decision on part of the sending MTA. We can certainly
Wait.
So
not.
Wait, Victor, we got remote people, so.
okay, sorry. STS downgrades the security of Dane. So if it's a kind of more ubiquitous but less secure option, if Dane exists, it really needs to be authoritative.
I think the way I saw it, I don't think that this is how everybody saw it, and I might be missing something. The way I saw it, if you're sending MTA, you might reasonably say if STS fails, fail the message. If Dane fails, fail the message, which I think would be reasonable.
No, but if STS says soft, if STS says soft fail, you
right.
but
That was exactly my point earlier with why we got rid of the Dane references, right? I think that the way we had it before was this sort of bad state Victor's talking about, where we said if STS says soft fail but authenticate with Dane, like what do? You're sort of circumventing Dane. So we don't have that now. I think now it's, as you were saying, it's essentially a sender policy question.
Okay.
As a sender, what I would do if I were validating both Dane and STS is I would fail if either one of them fails. As a recipient, you can certainly publish both. You may not want to, you might want to, I don't know.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, any more comments, questions?
I mean, we can walk through the open issues more, but I think there's sort of maybe better discussed on the list.
Right, so what we're trying to do here, or what I heard from the authors, they're trying to do is to get as much as possible feedback from the implementers in order to polish basically the text and the protocol and the system. As you saw, the companies are implementing it, and so it would be great to get this feedback, you know, as soon as possible. Go ahead.
Yeah, from Mark Risher, do any of the attendees know of other implementations beyond those that were on the slide?
You had a second? Please, the mic. Sorry? 10 lines up.
10 lines? Oh, sorry, yeah. Oh, yeah, sorry. Which one? Can't see it. Oh, yeah. Is there an EXIM implementation underway?
There is.
There is an EXIM implementation. I can't read. There is an EXIM implementation on the way. Do attendees know of any other implementations?
Exim? I've heard of it. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, Mark's saying the same thing. We would much rather have some working open source implementation that we could get some feedback from. And I think the thing that's really obviously missing from our perspective is just what it looks like to be deploying postfix or XIM for a small domain where you have maybe a backup MX hosted by somebody else, and you know, these kinds of things. And I'd really like to invite people to sort of do that and give us feedback earlier. I'm looking specifically at Victor.
So in postfix, we tend to not implement anything that can't be done 100% right. It'll take a while for us to be convinced that this can be done 100% right. In particular, you know, the timeouts for HTTP are underspecified here. What are recommendations there, and the like. So lots of things have to be pinned down. We have to be convinced that it scales with postfix and all the error conditions are right.
I mean, for examples like that, should we have? I think we shouldn't have normative specifications for what the timeout should be for.
SMTP specifies normative. Well, sorry, the recommended timeouts at least. And I don't remember whether it's a must or a should. Perhaps it's a should, but it's still normative.
Okay.
SMTP says that 300 seconds at least for mail from recipient to and so on timeouts, 600 for, you know, dot.
Okay.
Giving
And
more
you
time
think the
versus
normative
content.
spec should be that specific on things
Yes.
like, okay.
So that one can reasonably understand what the expectations are on the sending and receiving side. The other thing is that my experience with XIM is that they tend to stop short of dotting all the I's and crossing all the T's. So they have a Dane implementation, but it's a bit incomplete. And they think they're done, but you know, not entirely. And even though I donated code to them, they haven't finished the proper integration yet. So XIM may be done, but it may not be secure yet. You know, who knows? I'm sorry to shame them in public a little bit, but you know, that's kind of how it goes. So, you know, it's not really done until somebody's reviewed it, and I don't know who's going to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I do think we're sort of circling around this issue of like how to get the feedback that's that kind of detailed feedback, right? But
This is Barry Liba. So wait, there are 6 documents defining HTTP and how it works. And are you really saying that you want this document to give that kind of HTTP detail? I don't think that's appropriate. I think this points to those and say, that's how you do HTTP, and here's how you do this with HTTP.
Right, but this is Victor again. But if I'm blocking on an HTTP request in the middle of an email transaction, then I have to have some notion as to what's appropriate in this space. I don't know what timeouts HTTP does or doesn't specify. Maybe it leaves the issue entirely open. But if I'm to have a scalable MTA, I need to know what's expected of me, because the person provisioning the HTTP infrastructure might plan it for a certain scale and might expect people to wait a certain amount before they get serviced. And they ought to know that they should monitor for responses within the certain budget that the RFC recommends, or else, you know, email will start breaking. And MTAs, you know, with limited concurrency, postfix tries to not overwhelm the machine it's running on. It runs within a certain concurrency.
Like very implementation specific.
Right. But if the latency gets out of whack, we can't deliver mail to the domain.
Right. I mean, these are all like really reasonable implementation comments. I think I am sort of surprised that we would want to go to that level of specificity about things like, I mean, we take for granted that you can find a working secure HTTPS client because, you know, you should be able to, right? And like I think specifying that level of detail is sort of not totally appealing to me, both because, I think the RFCs exist for that already, and because I think the whole value proposition of what we're doing is you can already like get URL lib, tell it to validate certificates, and sort of not worry about it, right? Hopefully. Maybe not. Yeah, I mean, I think that this is like a reasonable question if you're sending from postfix and you want to know how long you should block, but that seems sort of to me like something that you would just, as the postfix author, you would sort of like figure out. Maybe I'm being optimistic.
So this is Barry. What I will agree with Victor on is that if you find that the normal way HTTP is used isn't sufficient for this, then it probably is reasonable to say, for this environment, here are different parameters that you need to use. But I think before you go sticking that in the document, we need to have some idea that that's really necessary for this use case.
And we wouldn't want that to be the case. I mean, as I was saying, the value proposition is not to do that, I think.
Okay, great. It seems like we had great discussion here. It seems there's no discussion to follow on the list. We would like to ask actually who in the audience, how to judge how many people in the audience actually read this latest draft. Okay, no, actually it's third, yeah, at least third of the audience. Great, that's great. Yes. Yes, so this was about the first draft. The second draft is about reporting.
Which is just one slide up. And do I have to say more than this? I mean, I think the reporting is very simple, and like I said, I sort of expect mostly uncontroversial.
Yeah, a comment from Kurt Anderson. What's normal for interactive web traffic is not necessarily normal, the needs for high performance MTA. So
is that true? I think web latency is user facing, and mail send latency is not really user facing. So is that? I said something I shouldn't.
Ted Hardy. Actually, what I was going to point out here is that there are going to be a bunch of different deployment considerations that will be different in different environments. So, for example, in a case where you have a long-lived HTTP connection where you're going to use the keep alive parameter, there's a timeout associated with that where you can tell the other party how long the connection should be available for. You can always keep it open longer. That won't be the case in all of these connections, right? That you have a persistent connection available. I think specifying it for all MTAs in all deployments would be startling. You might have some advice that says, hey, please consider this in making the engineering trade-offs of how long you're willing to wait. If you've got a very high performance MTA, you might wait a shorter amount of time before moving on than if you've got one that's basically got a persistent connection to one or a very small number of hosts. Writing that as deployment considerations with the engineering trade-offs for different conditions makes sense to me. Standardizing on a particular set would be surprising behavior.
This is Barry. Yes, what Ted said. And in response to, yeah, something that's user-facing, you want it to be quick, but the user can tolerate a few second delay before he sees something. When your MTA has to transmit 1 million messages a minute, you can't tolerate a few second delay.
Sure, yeah. I mean, if you were looking up the policy for, a different domain per message, which could happen, I think it would be potentially very, very expensive.
Even if one lookup delays you by a few seconds, you've started to build up a queue that may take you a while to fix.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I agreed with that. I think two questions about this. One is I think this goes a bit to the comment of these are different trade-offs for different deployments. I think it would be hard to say sort of normatively what trade-off you should make. I guess the other question I have is this a situation where the policy host needs to be understanding that trade-off on part of sort of most senders? Like, is it the case that if I deploy my policy on a relatively slow HTTPS endpoint, it will be a big problem for people who have short message, can't tolerate a long message queue? And if that's the case, then yeah, maybe we want to say, take this into consideration. People may have trouble delivering to your domain if the policy fetch takes a while.
Ted Hardy, I absolutely agree that taking it into account on both sides of it is perfectly reasonable, but we also have to acknowledge that the system must be at least reasonably robust to delay, simply because there are delays built into the layer below TCP, the layer below, TCP, and there's always the possibility that after you've done the TCP handshake, you get something like a routing change that causes this to take longer than you expect, right? So a reasonable amount of robustness to variation in this is also part of what the system has to have. And I think describing what the variations can be is useful in making people aware of what the engineering trade-offs are, but really demanding it of the internet system is not going to work well.
Sorry, Orit specifically asked about TLS report. One thing is that a piece of what should go in TLS report is currently still in the STS spec draft, and that is the registrations of the deep things are really report specific. They're living in the wrong draft at the moment.
Which
there's a section 7 or something or whatever in the STS draft that's really a whole bunch of verbs or attributes, whatever, that describe failure modes that really belong in the reporting because they're not STS specific.
Yeah,
so
I
that
no longer remember this, so I can't sort of speak to it. We had made an effort to sort of generalize the errors, and that's actually one of the points here. Is we had, I think, originally said, oh, we can come up with a taxonomy of ways in which TLS connections fail, and then we have a nice sort of schema here, and we realized you sort of can't do that. I mean, you could sort of do it for OpenSSL in general cases because a lot of people use it, but you can't really do this in the general case, I think.
Well, I mean, but you have specific things. They just belong in the report draft, just move them over.
We were inclined to saying it might be an editorial error because we sort of made the effort, I think, mostly to remove, as I recall, to remove sort of specific. I mean, is it still in there? Okay, I'm wrong.
So that's still there. It needs to move. The other is to maybe finish off the topic. The main reason I want to think about timeouts is that if they're long, recommended to be by default, be generous to the HTTP server, then that might change the design in terms of whether you recommend that the MTA proceed to send and fetch policy in the background, and later
this was my question.
Future messages might benefit from the policy, but the one you're currently sending just acts as a probe to trigger it, or whether in fact the current message should block, but then that message stalls for the recommended duration. These issues all
this was my
interact.
question. I think it matters insofar as it changes design decisions by the policy host, change some decisions around the sender, as you were describing. And I think it's sort of worth describing how we expect it to happen to reach some consensus there.
Yeah, John Levine, the TLS reporting stuff is still kind of underspecified. Like if you say, like it says, if it says mail to, you says mail it, but you're supposed to send the JSON in the body of the message, or is it an attachment, or is it a compressed attachment like it is in DMARC? And the other thing is, we understand this is not the same as DMARC, but in DMARC, third parties collecting reports turned out to be really useful, which meant that you needed some way to publish the fact that domain A is willing to get reports for domain B, so you need to stick that in.
Yeah. I've read this. It's I think we left it out because it was complicated. But doing it the exact same way as DMARC is reasonable and sort of has the right security trade-offs, I think. So
it turns out not to be that complicated. So
I don't see any people at the mic. So I will try to kind of summarize the points and tell me if it's correct. So the first one, it seems to me that there is a lot of a tuning of parameters that is going to be, will need to be done, and probably this is going to be based even on implementation experience going forward. But basically, that's one area. What else?
I think regarding that, I am not still entirely sure how to proceed in the sense that, I think some of that will be very implementation dependent. And some of that, the degree of specificity, I think we're not all, I don't know that, I think Victor wants to be more specific than I do, for example. And I'm sort of not sure quite where the middle ground is there. Right. So I think some of that is still a little bit.
So it's kind of, maybe it's two issues. One is the tuning of parameters, and the other one is the specificity of state machine and stuff, and actually explain how it all works. And then, so these two kind of we discussed and identified. Do we see any additional issues that you would like to get, that you are stuck with, basically, you as the team of authors, that you would like feedback for, or you have enough homework?
Sort of looking at my co-authors, I think no.
Okay, that's good.
I'm sure we'll discover stuff as we implement, but not at this point.
Okay, and you feel that you do have enough homework to do for the next revision?
I think so.
Excellent. Okay.
Chris Newman, just wanted to mention that there's a set of tasks related to aligning MUA and MTA STS. I'll talk about those more in my presentation, but I should be on the hook to review the reporting spec in detail to make sure that it applies to both protocols. So keep me on the hook for that.
Absolutely, will do.
Dan York, and I have read the draft and looking through that. I think as I looked at this before, but now I'm seeing again, you're still relying on a trust and first use, right? You're still, there's still some mechanism that the attacker could disrupt that before they get to you. Okay, so you're still, I think the security considerations could spell that out, maybe even use that term, because we're using that, within the space of that. I saw the future work pieces were looking at how to mitigate that or how to do that in some way. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's exactly the same semantics as HSDS, for example, right?
Yeah.
I think we'd be happy, for example, one very easy thing that we could do sort of off the bat is like a preload list, which I think is reasonable. Have a bundled set of policies that ship with your MTA, right? Longer term, we sort of describe things, public key pinning, cert transparency, so you can sort of have a
sure. This is also space where, working with DNSSEC for people who have published, if their MX records are signed through that and the validation's occurring, then that you're getting that. And then those two, it's a space where they can work together because at that point, you have the correct MX records or the correct, and you can be able to connect to the correct sites. So, okay.
Yeah.
Just for the record, I don't believe that either public key pinning or certificate transparency have any chance of being applicable here. That's why I talked about the feature section should be largely deleted. I don't know if this is the time to really delve into detail. How much time do people have? Are you interested in some exposition of this, or?
I mean, I'm curious. You can email me later.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Okay. So certificate transparency relies on the log servers being able to distinguish between completely made up gibberish reports and reports that actually are true observations because the certificate chains are signed. In here, the only party that's able to validate the signature is the client that connects to the server. Where we don't have a signed piece of data, we have a signed transmission channel in the form of HTTPS. So if I observe a particular policy, there's no way I can convey to the log that I observed a valid policy. The log cannot be convinced by me reporting it. And so the log can be spammed into irrelevance. The attackers can fill the log with so much gibberish that you won't be able to tell the good from the bad. And this is a fatal obstacle to getting CT working in this space. For example, I don't think that CT really can work here in the same way that it can work for X509.
Without having signed policies served.
Right, and so your CA would have to then be involved in signing your policies, which, hey, you can go there.
You could do, yeah.
Sorry, but I don't think you're likely to really want the CA to start issuing signed MTA policies and have to wait for them to issue you a signature for your policy before you can deploy it. So the serious issues there. If you really want to think about it, it's unlikely to fly. As for pinning, in many a deployment, if you want to not absolutely pin down the names of your MX hosts, so you would say star.example.com, then the attacker merely can substitute another MX host for example.com.
No, I meant key pinning, but yeah.
No, key pinning. The key pinning is per host because different hosts will have different keys. Yeah. So if I pin the key for MX1 and MX2.example.com, the attacker, the man-in-the-middle attacker, will say, at this moment, the MX hosts are MX3. And the client will say, great, correct MX host. And the policy matches. He'll use a certificate that, is a CA, everything checks out. But pinning is supposed to prevent the CA being able to.
No, so you can pin obviously farther up the
signature. You can say that all the MTAs have to have the same.
Right. This doesn't solve the trust and first usage. I mean, it's sort of orthogonal.
No. But what I'm saying is that the attacker can shift if you pin across all the MTAs. Yes, you might get some protection. Of course, many people, and I am skeptical that this is actually practical. It'll break as often as it works. But
I'm leery of pinning because of the
But in many cases, the pinning across all the MTAs isn't viable because people get different sets of different MTAs. There'll be backup MX hosts and the like. And so pinning works rather poorly. We shouldn't expect it to be a savior
Why would you?
I mean,
backup
DKG
access
isn't
doesn't
here.
I don't know.
I remember him saying that already works very poorly for HSTS, and I think it's even offers weaker protection for SMTP.
Well, it's not related to
Because
the
of the
just-in-first
indirection.
use issue anyway, so it's sort of
Right. But anyway, so
I think
skeptical
the
very much on both.
preload list is very easy. For example, I think past that point,
Okay, great discussion. So I guess, yeah, we're done here. We're good. Thank you,
I
Dan.
think we have a lot of feedback. Thank you, guys.
That's great. So now we are going to Chris, who will provide update on his draft.
Okay, this is I've renamed the deep drafts title, not the draft name yet, but the title to SDS for MUAs to help align these proposals since they are doing the similar thing. Moving on, this is my overview slide. For the protocol, but that's no big changes here, so we can move forward. So here's the key changes in the new draft. I've changed the terminology, and I've also changed to using the term directives, which is the term that HSTS uses for what I was calling, security keys and latches. And so I've switched to directives for that. I've changed the protocol syntax to the key with optional value syntax that HSTS uses. And I removed the DSN header as, if we want that, it belongs in the MTA relay SDS document. So we should have a discussion of if we want to just drop that feature altogether or just take that text and stuff it in the correct document. And then a bunch of editorial work, more details on that in the draft. So next slide. So yeah, the big issue that's open on this is alignment of the MUA and MTA SDS specs. So I think I've moved forward on this by changing, the terminology. But I just want to, but I think it's important to align these because email technology is already very complicated. So we want to avoid adding more complexity than necessary to email. So the closer these are to being to sharing appropriate technology, they're very different use cases for STS. So you can't, they need to be separate specs. They are separate proposals, but there is appropriate technology to share. So next slide. So roughly what I would start, the starting point for a alignment proposal is, so I've started turning the registry that was in deep into a directive registry for STS in general. That would cover MUA, MTA, and HSTS. So it would be one registry for all of them, kind of like the email header, or like the header registry covers HTTP and email headers. So it would be a shared registry along those lines where the items in the registry say what protocol those items apply to. Question I'm unsure about is, should we have a preferred directive syntax? Now, right now, the current STS draft, I believe it's using JSON for the directives, and HSTS is using HTTP parameter value syntax, which is, key optional value with semicolon delimiter. And so I went mostly to copying the HTTP syntax, but it turns out if you allow double quotes around the value, that screws up, then it doesn't slot into the MUA protocol. So I removed that from the syntax. The question is syntax alignment matter, or do we just want to say, okay, these are abstract key with optional value, and then the syntax for your protocol is protocol specific? Do people have an opinion on that?
Hi, Dan Margolis again. So I don't care about the syntax, obviously. I don't write parsers. I use parser libraries somebody else wrote, so I think it doesn't matter too much. The registry, like my larger question on this is, do we think that there are items in the registry which are shared, or are they entirely disjoint sets?
So the one I know of that's shared is MaxAge is shared by MTA STS and HSTS. That MaxAge is shared.
Yeah.
That may be the only one in the initial set. But is that a problem? I mean,
I think, like, I hate to say this because it makes me sound like I don't want to sort of have code reuse or spec reuse, but then my question is, if that's the only thing that's shared, what advantages are in a shared registry?
Well, the separate registries, then each document has to define its own registry and describe the registration process and have its own expert reviewer and go through the whole IETF review process or IANA review process to create the registry. And so there's a certain amount of overhead to creating an IANA registry, and I'm trying to share that overhead. That's why I'm leaning towards a common registry, but I'm not firmly in that direction. So,
Dave Crocker, it seems to me there should be an overriding sense that these are reasonable to keep together. And the whole point behind a registry is extensibility. There could be more headers or header fields.
Right. So I think I have it on the next slide, but I proposed an expert review model for the registry.
So as long as there is an overriding sense that it makes sense for these to be together, that over the long haul, there's a fair amount of overlap and very likely sharing of entries, even if there's only one right now, then it would make sense to have only one. Having them be separate creates the problem that should there be sharing, you've just created a whole lot more work and the opportunity for becoming divergent.
Right. I think the reality is somewhere in the middle of those two positions. I don't think there's a strong case that there's a hugely strong case for sharing them, but I think there is an example of overlap. So I lean towards sharing them right now.
For Sean Leonard, as a parser writer, reuse is good, and for security, reusing constructs that have already been analyzed would help to lead to fewer implementation errors. So also for sharing.
Sorry, Dan Margolis again. What are some examples of extensions that we would want to add in the future? So I think for deep, it's more obvious to me because you're trying to provide security constructs which might rely on other primitives in the future. For STS, we might, but I think STS almost is the primitive, and so the extensibility case is less clear to me.
Well, I mean, HSTS had the same situation where they, when they published it, they didn't think there was any extensibility, and there's already a there's already a limited use extension to HSTS out in the wild. So my thinking is we've already seen an example where an extension is needed. Let's just I've already written most of the registry work. All I need to do is split this out into a separate draft. We reference it. We're done.
Next to the comment, I think I directly can comment on whether the registry should be joined or not, but I just want to say that the STS registry is really the report registry, not the STS registry. The bulk of the terms there apply equally to any MTA to MTA
right.
report.
Those need to be separate registries. The STS directive registry is separate from the reporting registry. Right. Those are clearly separate functions. Let's see. Okay. So, I had one more bullet on the previous slide. The other area where we need to talk about alignment is reporting mechanisms. So right now, the MUA STS has an in-band reporting mechanism, and SMTP STS has that out-of-band reporting mechanism that was just split out into a shared spec. So I think it's interesting to share the out-of-band reporting mechanism between both proposals. So if there's no objections to moving in that direction, then I'm on the hook to review the out-of-band reporting mechanism and you know, to make sure it has the features that I think MUAs need for reporting.
And conversely, I was advocating stronger for the other direction, strongly to share the in-band reporting mechanism as much as possible. I'd like to see one for STS and Dane. So if you're willing to write up or with me to write up the common in-band mechanism, that'd be super.
So there is an in-band mechanism in the MUA STS draft right now. Oh God, I really don't want to edit a third draft, but is that the right thing to do, is split that out into a third draft that we both reference? And it would be kind of, and I think it would actually be a non-normative reference, which would be the nice thing about it.
Right. So I think, Dan Margolis again, on the in-band, I definitely don't see a downside to having, you know, a different error code for, like, I mean, for server-to-server SMTP. If you say I terminated the connection because of a TLSA failure, I think it's quite reasonable to have a different quick code for that. I think presumably that's a different draft. Both in-band and out-of-band seem to me to be useful, and conceivably you would implement both. So, you know.
Okay, it looks like a call for joint work here.
Yeah,
Or very specific.
it looks like there's leaning towards both. So okay, more work for me. There we go. Yes. Oh, that's a good. Would anyone be willing to co-edit the in-band reporting mechanism? That would be wonderful. Thank you. May the minutes note that Victor volunteered. Okay, the shared STS registry. I was noting most of the directives are protocol specific because these three use cases are quite different. You know, the semantics are just so different between the use case, even though it really is the same function we're performing, same core function. I'm not sure I have a clear view on whether we should share syntax or not yet. I just, you know, I feel if people are already deploying code with the JSON syntax, maybe we shouldn't change. But
So actually on this topic, it's kind of two questions here. The obvious question that we always ask, how many people read the draft, but also how many people actually implemented something from your draft? I think that's the question that you need to ask.
well, I mean, I just changed the syntax incompatibly, so
Okay.
in my draft. So there you go.
Okay.
I mean, it also has the warning, don't implement yet at the top.
Correct.
Because I believe in, reaching to the point where I think it's done before I remove that warning.
So you need to decide
I'm
quickly.
looking for more guidance on whether or not to share a syntax, and I'm not hearing anything.
Do you have a sense of sort of how many people are lined up? I know this is putting you on the spot, but how many people are lined up to implement this, or what the sort of seeing it in production timeline would be?
On MUA STS, I don't have a clear sense of that. I mean, that's a fair question. No, I don't have a clear sense right now for the timeline. I mean, it's been, I've been working on the spec for longer, but there you go. Okay,
I really think you need to ask this question on the list, because in the past we heard some voices, people saying they're implementing something of it. So
okay.
we will ask it on. Please ask it again on the list, and you will get a better sense.
Okay. So why don't I go ahead with the assumption that we're not sharing syntax, since we're not right now, and that's less change. And then if somebody has a strong feeling that syntax should be shared, we can address that when that comes up. The other thing about the shared registry is I'm proposing it be expert review and that there be a limited use flag. It's either common use or limited use for a registry entry. So basically the expert review bar for a limited use entry would be much lower because there's always the tension in a registry between collision avoidance and where you want to make it easy to register and clear semantics where you want to make it hard to register so the semantics of what it means are clear. And so I like the limited use flag as the compromise between those two. And we already have one example of limited use that will be registered in the HSTS space after this is published. So that's why that flag's there. So that's it for the shared registry, I think. The areas where drafts are not aligning, MTA, STS, sorry, it's just HTTPS now. Pretend the DNSSEC wasn't there. Well, MUA STS uses in-band TLS. They're just different on how that works. The MTA relay and HSTS use max age, and the MUA STS, we decided not to use that. And then other directives are protocol specific. So this is where the protocols don't align. I think is that my last slide? I think it is. Yep. Okay. Any other comments on MUA STS? Okay, I'll try to turn around a couple revisions as quickly as I can to get this done.
Excellent.
Thank you. Okay, so now we're ready for our remote presenter. Good luck to us.
Jim, you should step up to the Meet Echo queue. So, Jim, if you're listening to the remote stream, you should step up to the Meet Echo microphone now, and I will. Oh yeah.
He's learning the system.
Oh, trying to figure out.
Yeah.
All right.
While there's an interlude, is Alexei here? Oh, there. So Alexei Melikov is one of the art IDs, and Alexei knows like crap loads more about email than I do. So we thought it might make sense to swap kind of the responsible ID for the working group at some point in the near future, I guess. So we chatted about it with the chairs. It doesn't make any real difference, but just so you know and are not shocked or surprised or anything. But Alexei will be the responsible helper as opposed to me from sometime near in the future.
Oh yeah. So let's see what happens if I press this. That means that you get to talk, Jim.
Hi, can you hear me all right?
Oh yeah.
Oh, hey, good, it works. I finally found the right button on Meet Echo. So are my slides up in the room there?
Yeah, your intro slide is up. Just tell me when to flip and I'll try to give you feedback on what's showing.
Okay, bear with me just a sec. I was busy with Meet Echo and I need to figure out how to get my slides so I can see them here as well. So it'll take a second. Here we go. All right, so I don't have a whole lot to report on Require TLS this time around. I presented it, I think, fairly extensively down in Buenos Aires, and I hope people remember that, but I have some backup slides if people would like me to represent some of that. It's a different approach to applying stronger requirements TLS transport for SMTP, where this comes from the sending side rather than a policy that's published by the recipient side. So rather than having some sort of a policy record that's published, this is basically a tag that goes along. It's on a very fine-grained basis. It's message by message, and the essentially that tag follows along and essentially makes sure that both require TLS and the TLS with the proper characteristics are used whenever the message is forwarded onward. So please go on to I think it's slide 2, review problem statement.
You're in.
Okay. So the problem that I'm trying to solve here is that TLS is opportunistic. Now, that's often what you would really like to have happen. You want email to be delivered. That's kind of the postal paradigm. Deliver the mail whenever you can. But what that means in practice here is that if you can't negotiate start TLS, you basically send the message without start TLS. If you can't verify the server certificate, you basically note the fact that it failed and you send that and send the message anyway. But this is often what you want, but it's not always what you want. There are times when you want to send a sensitive message. There are times in particular where you would like additional protection for even the header information, the envelope information that are not protected by end-to-end encryption. And for example, think of a foreign correspondent that's sending something from a war zone or something like that. There might be situations where they want to make sure that message either is sent securely or isn't sent at all. So go on to the next slide. And so I missed the cutoff for the internet draft. I do have a revision kind of in the works, but I kind of felt that since I missed the cutoff, it's inappropriate for me to try and present a new revision here. But be looking for one. I just kind of wanted to let everybody know that I'm still working on this. I have been advised that there is one commercial MTA that is planning to do an implementation of this. So we'll have something to test it with, since it's one MTA, probably not in terms of interoperability, but at least in terms of effectiveness. If there are any questions, or if there's a sense whether I should go back and give a quick review of what Require TLS is, I'd be happy to do that.
Question, I remember on the list there was some discussion, this is Victor Duchovny, I remember on the list there was some discussion as to whether the thing should be very specific as to the properties of Require TLS and mandate ciphers and all kinds of things, or in order to be usable, be much looser and sort of allow these things to be underspecified. And I don't know that we reached consensus on that one. The other thing I wanted to mention is that there probably should be a converse specification in which you say, no, my mail, in fact, has nothing of any sensitivity at all, but damn well deliver it even if there's STS or DANE, because it's time sensitive. So in addition to Require TLS spec, we might want to say a fuck TLS spec, if I may say so, or whatever, and just send the torpedoes, whatever.
Okay, that's interesting. So I agree, we haven't reached consensus about how specific Require TLS should be. I'm essentially not planning on making any changes right now, pending some more discussion on that topic. A lot of the changes that I wanted to describe were things about kind of the motivation and deployment. And probably less on the details of the protocol. That's an amusing suggestion to write a fuck TLS specification. I don't think I'm the person to write that one.
All right, was that it?
That was all I had, unless people would like a review of what required TLS is.
All right. Let me actually ask who here in the room has read the required TLS, at least the last draft? Oh, a couple of people, a fair number of people. So it doesn't, I don't know if anybody feels they want an introduction to the topic. There's one hand for introduction. I don't know if that counts. Nah, you can get that offline, Ola. So
Yeah, feel
I
free to
think that's it.
contact me if anybody wants a one-off intro.
So we got questions at the mic.
Olle Johansson. Coming from the world of SIP, I'm very interested in this because we failed miserably in SIP with something called a SIP SURI, where UA requires a TLS session almost all the way to the other UA, because there's no proof what happens between the different proxy servers. And we're trying to fix that in various ways, but still haven't fixed it. So maybe this is a similar problem. I have a feeling that you're trying to solve the same problem as we do, and how to set up a secure session, the first hop, and maybe do something with the following hops. So I'm particularly interested in this work and see if I can steal some inspiration back to the SIP core group. Thanks.
Okay, well, thanks. I'm not familiar with that SIP-S specification. I'll have a look at it. I will note that we are expecting a certain amount of good behavior on the part of intermediaries, but on the other hand, we're expecting that anyway if they're handling our email.
Yeah, this is Barry. That's really the key, that if you say you're doing it, you're supposed to do it, and there's no verification that it actually happened. No. And I gather that SIP wanted that verification.
Yeah, Ole back. This is an old specification, but so far I haven't seen any implementation that actually follows the specification properly. Failing that, we have no other way to require a TLS session in the first hop, and that's something I really want to solve.
Open mic.
Okay, so I guess we went through all our agenda, and we really ask people to continue work on the list. And I think it even looks to me that based on these discussions, we will decide later whether we meet face-to-face at the next meeting or not. Really, let's provide feedback on the list and move forward this way.
So I guess we're into, I'm going to mute you off, Jim, thanks. Is there anybody, we're in open mic, so open for other business. You might get an hour back approximately. Well, not quite an hour, but not seeing anybody rushing to the mic. I guess we close the meeting early, and maybe see you in Seoul or maybe not. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody who didn't sign the blue sheet, come up and do so. And there's one blue sheet thingy missing somewhere in the room. Ah, there it is. Thank you.